you were talking about language and inspiration. And if I take one of Jesus' instructions in Mark 16:15 is to go into the world, he told his disciples, and proclaim the good news to all creation. I really think we're struggling with understanding what proclaim is in our time and how we talk about what Jesus is asking us to do. But I think there's some good examples, and I just look at maybe the recovery programs in addiction, where you have people coming in who are battered and bruised through their life, at the bottom of their life. The last thing they really want to talk about is God. And yet they come into a program that was designed by a doctor and a minister, put together, that has been so successful. And the program they work off, the 12-step program, has 10 steps of the 12 steps that they are to apply to life, involves a spiritual process. Well, it actually God, but it's called a higher power in that case. The rate of people who are long-term in AA and GA finding God is unbelievably high. So that's a good example maybe of how an example of proclaiming.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that question. I think I've recently read a book about proclamation by Rudolf Bultmann. He uses the actual original Greek word kerygma. Kerygma is the word for proclamation. And kerygma, I think, obviously a hugely important part of our tradition. By the way, in relation to AA, one of my own intellectual sources played a major role. That was Carl Jung. He saw Bill W. In Zurich, and Bill W. told him his life story about how he was addicted to alcohol. And Jung, I think, was in a gruff, as often the Swiss are actually, Swiss Germans, a gruff manner. And he said to him, "Look, Bill, I think you're a goner. You know, you're a lost case. You've gone from therapist to therapist to therapist to try to recover something. Nothing will work for you unless you have a spiritual experience." And he sat down with him, and of course Jung knew Latin, and Jung said to Bill W., "Spiritus contra spiritum," which in English means, in order to overcome your addiction to spirits, as in alcoholic spirits, you will need a contact with spirit, the higher spirit or the higher power. And at that moment, Bill W. thought, now I don't understand this, but Jung said something very powerful. And he went back to New York, and then Alcoholics Anonymous, as you say, was formed with that religious background. I've had a fair bit to do with Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've actually published on the 12-step program myself. And I think it is a very good example of how spirituality can help people in great need. It's a classic example of Leonard Cohen's "there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." And one of the things I love about the 12-step program is that it says a higher power and a God as you understand him. I think that's so important. You know, so they're not actually saying take on a creedal position about God, because that may not be to most people's likings. But it's important that we add that phrase, as you understand him. And that is partly, I think, why Alcoholics Anonymous movement or the program is so unbelievably successful, and has been since, the 1930s or 40s when it got started. And of course, there's now Overeaters Anonymous, there's Drug Taking Anonymous, there's a whole lot of things, and a lot of people are finding that what they've been searching for, say they're addicted to sex, or say they're addicted to consumerism, or say they're addicted to food. And I always think of St. Augustine's Confessions, where he says, we are always longing for more, but that more can only be found in God. We were made in thy image, O Lord, and our hearts are ever restless until they find their rest in thee. That's a quote from the Confessions. And I was surprised, or perhaps not, to find that in Overeaters Anonymous they actually use that phrase. So what we're finding in society today is that although on the surface our culture looks more and more secular, more and more godless actually, more and more anti-religious, people who fall through the cracks, or should I say the gaps, are finding that they are turning to a spirituality which is life-giving and refreshing. So I think that's very powerful. It means that what's happening in our society, the gloss over the top is that we're in the lucky country that doesn't need God. And Britain's a bit the same. I mean, when Tony Blair went to Washington with his publicity advisor, Tony Campbell, and Tony Blair and Tony Campbell were asked, did they believe in God? And before Tony Blair could reply, because Tony Blair is himself a very religious man, Anthony Campbell said, we don't do God in Britain. You know, we don't do God in Britain. And that was the end of that, because the Americans do God. You know, that's one of the reasons why I found living in America, as I did, actually a very rewarding experience. I could get over my Australian embarrassment about being a believer. You know, in America, you are expected to believe. Now, you're not expected to believe in the same thing, but it's expected that if you've thought deeply, like my taxi driver said yesterday, if you think deeply, then you come up with God. So a lot of Australians haven't thought deeply enough. But what is happening in our society are those people who are victims of consumerism, victims of depression. You know, we have 1 out of 5 Australians suffering from depression. That's a massive figure. 20% of the lucky country is unluckily battling with depression on a daily basis. And I imagine that religion is going to come up from below. It's not going to come up from the top of the people saying you should believe. It's going to come up from those people who have broken apart, who have had breakdowns, who have had difficulty. They are the people that will, I think, bring a religious revival into this country. It's going to be a grassroots from the ground up. And when you think about it, of course that makes sense. In the world of nature, everything new comes up from below. Grasses, trees, everything starts as a little seed. And the seed has to break apart in order to become the plant. And I think that's what's happening in Australia. And a few years ago I wrote a book about it. I called it The Spirituality Revolution. And I said it's the revolution that's not on the front pages of newspapers. It's a hidden revolution of going on in therapists' rooms with chaplains, pastoral care workers, people realising that they need God in their lives, but it's not glamorous. They're not coming to God, as I often say, through the front door. They're coming through the back door of suffering and of despair often. And as Elaine said this morning, you don't need God until you're desperate. And not enough Australians are desperate because it's too good here. And that's part of our problem, is that although we've got terrific conditions to live in, they are not conducive on the whole to spiritual reflection. It's only people who have difficulty that actually end up, and of course alcoholics are classic examples.